Welcome to Democracy Does, the Civic Power Playbook, a podcast that cuts through the noise to explain what's really happening in our democracy. Each episode breaks down key issues with insight from policy experts and change makers, giving you clear tips to take action. Whether you're fired up or feeling stuck, you're in the right place to get informed and get inspired, because democracy works best when we all... Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Democracy Does, the Civic Power Playbook. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Robert Boatwright. He is a professor at Clark University, and he teaches courses on American political parties, campaigns, elections, and interest groups. He has focused a lot of his work on primary elections, particularly congressional and state legislative primaries. He's also the director of research for the National Institute for Civil Discourse, a nonpartisan organization promoting healthy civil and political debate. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Boatwright. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.
So much has been buzzing around in the news about elections. And, we're approaching midterms. A lot of elections are happening right now. And I wanted to know, first of all, just in your expertise, do you have any concerns about the current state of our democracy, namely voting? And tell me why or why not.
Well, it's really two questions. There's a lot to be worried about regarding the current state of our democracy. Right now, we have Congress that is not really acting as a check on the president, a president who is not necessarily following the laws that Congress passes. So there's a lot to be worried about. That's got very little to do with voting per se. The way our system is set up, unlike, say, a parliamentary system, is we only get to vote every so often. So lots of Americans are just sitting there waiting to express themselves at the voting booth. In terms of my concerns about voting, that's really a different question. There's a lot of misinformation out there about voting, and there are a lot of concerns that people have raised over the past few weeks about whether the 2026 election is going to be free and fair. I can't make any promises to anyone. I think that a big role that I've had over the past year or two is people come to me and they say, "Are things going to be okay?" And I've learned not to make promises.
Right.
But our voting system, it's we don't have one national system of voting. The voting is the responsibility of the states. And there's really no way for anybody at the federal level to interfere with the voting process in the states. So I'm not so concerned about that. There are a handful of states where the federal government has gotten involved, has raised questions about the fairness of voting, has raised questions about whether people who should not be voting are showing up, that sort of thing. And I think the best way to think about that is that a lot of questions are going to be out there, right? There's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the months leading to the election. So even if we do have an election that is fair, where the votes are counted accurately and so on, there are going to be a lot of people who don't believe that. And in many ways, it's the belief that is more harmful than the actuality. So I guess you could say I'm not worried about the integrity of our voting system, but I'm worried about the effect on Americans if a lot of people are told that there's something wrong, even if there's not.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that leads me to my next question, in that the University of California, San Diego, UCSD, their Center for Transparent and Trusted Elections, recently released the results of a poll that said trust in the integrity of the United States voting system has declined. Now, they did poll 11,000 people, so they had a sample, but they were Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And only 60% said they believe the 2026 elections will be counted accurately. And I wanted to know, what do you think of those numbers, first of all? And what does that say about public opinion in the democratic process? Because it goes back to your point of being, well, if people are being told something, then does that mean they are more likely to sit out?
Um, Well, again, there's a few questions there, so let me try to unpack that.
Yes.
Americans' trust in pretty much every single political and social institution has steadily gone down for my entire lifetime, your entire
Yeah.
lifetime. If you compare Americans' trust in higher education, in Congress, in the president, in organized religion, right? You name it, right?
Yeah.
People are much
Even
more
media.
skeptical. Yeah, exactly. The media is a great example. People are unhappy with all of these things, and it's easy to pick and choose, right? To point to failings
Correct.
of all of these institutions. But a lot of this trust isn't about one particular incident, right? It's about a general perception that things are not fair, that elites are getting away with too much,
Right.
and so on. So voting is one example of that, the election system. And just as it's the case that there are many, I mean, to take your media example, there are hundreds, thousands of respectable, responsible journalists who are just trying to do the right thing that Americans don't think about when they think about this thing. The same thing I think goes for elections. The vast majority, almost all elections in the United States are conducted in a scrupulously fair way,
Mhm.
but we don't hear about that, right? We don't think about that,
Yeah.
right? If you take the question of whether non-citizens are voting, there have been
Right.
inquiries into this for years, and the number of non-citizens who wind up voting is trivial, right?
Right.
But there are some examples, right? And so it's easy for people to fixate on the handful of examples rather than to think about how incredibly unlikely it is
Right.
that non-citizens would in fact vote. Um, so I think that's one way to think about the trust issue. Another way to think about this is that we don't necessarily see votes being counted. We don't necessarily see all of the things that go into voting systems. And, you know, computer systems or other things that get used here, it's very difficult to walk the average citizen through all of these things.
Mhm.
And most citizens don't have the time for this. Um, but it breeds a sort of mistrust, right? It's always easier to think that there's something nefarious going on when it's a process that you don't necessarily see. A lot of states over the past few years have started adopting this policy of responding to every question they get about the integrity of voting, no matter how, silly the question
Right.
is, no matter how misinformed the question is. And that takes a tremendous amount of resources. But in some of the states where the 2020 election results were called into question, places like Michigan, Arizona, the people who are in charge of voting made sure to make it as transparent as possible to citizens. And the handful of citizens who observed that, they came away and they said, well, I guess there wasn't anything fraudulent that I
Yeah.
saw. So people who actually have investigated this have wound up feeling slightly better, but it's difficult to translate that, right? After all, thousands of Americans might suspect this, but don't necessarily take that next step of actually learning about how vote tallying works.
Then how do you explain something like what's happening in Georgia, for example, when federal agents came and raided the Georgia election office? What were your thoughts about that?
Well, the president has a theory that the 2020 election has been stolen. This has been investigated and debunked numerous times.
Yes.
Um, I don't want to get deep into my suspicions about folks in the executive branch, but the person who's put in charge of this, Tulsi Gabbard, is the director of national intelligence, right? This is not really even her job.
Mhm.
But she, I think, took this on as a thing to investigate. The fact that it is being investigated for a certain percentage of Americans, it feeds their suspicion that something is wrong. So I don't know that we'll get any evidence from this that proves much of anything, in large part because people have already looked at the Georgia results repeatedly. But if you're just casually taking a look at the news, the fact that Georgia is being investigated might confirm your deepest suspicions.
Right.
So I think that's what we'll see over the next few months, that there's going to be a lot of talk about problems. And that may very well, in the end, enable some people to say, oh, well, the election was rigged. It's much easier to sow suspicion than it is to actually interfere in the counting of votes or in the conduct of elections.
That's right. And I want to go back to the point you made earlier in terms of certain states that went to painstaking efforts to show the transparency of the process. Does that mean that other states have to start doing that to assuage fears and suspicions? Is that even possible when you talk about the resources that are needed to do that?
Well, it does take tremendous resources to do this. The states that really have had to do this are the states that the 2020 presidential election was close in, and there are not that many of those, right? There are a half dozen states that have really received the brunt of this. There's this kind of free-floating suspicion that is out there everywhere, right? I live in Massachusetts, which is a state that rarely has competitive general elections, and you'll occasionally run into people here who have their suspicions, but it's not really been a big thing here because even if there were, a small disparity in the election results here, it wouldn't actually result in anybody different being elected. So most states are like that. People are suspicious of election results, but they tend to be most suspicious in places where the election results would actually enable somebody else to win. But it is, to get back to your original contention, yes, it does take tremendous resources to talk to the public about this. We've seen substantial burnout among election officials. Many people who are involved in various aspects of the voting process, or some of them are volunteers, who may just decide it's not worth their while.
Hmm.
Others are people who do not get into this job to pursue any sort of, they're not seeking higher office. They're not seeking
Right.
to make a name for themselves. So there have been a huge number of retirements.
Mm.
It's become increasingly difficult to get people to volunteer to work at the polls, and that will have a long-term effect. It'll just be much more difficult to get people to do these jobs.
Hmm. And also, what about the fact that, from what I was reading, that they may be asking people to double check ballots as well? I had read something. This was when I was reading in about the Georgia case, that there was going to be an extra layer of counting, and someone had said that's going to take things even longer to do. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and unfortunately, I don't have the specifics. But had you heard that, and is that something that you think is realistic or can be implemented or should be implemented?
Well, any defeated candidate generally has the right. The precise threshold varies by state, but
Yeah.
any defeated candidate has the right to ask for a recount, and these things are quite common in primaries or in general elections that are decided by, say, less than half a percentage of the vote. And I think most Americans would say, sure, if an election is really that close, then it should be possible to do a recount. So there's nothing wrong with that per se. Questions are often raised about who pays for these things. In many
Yes.
circumstances, losing candidates wind up paying for recounts. One of the oddities of U.S. campaign finance law is that both parties are able to raise money for separate funds to deal with post-election recounts, litigation, that sort of thing, which might create the incentive to question results if you already have the money to deal with them. Um, so there's nothing wrong with that per se, but of course, if candidates who've lost by comfortable margins are calling for recounts or are calling the entire system into question, that again will have an effect on Americans.
Hmm.
And then the other thing that I think is important to note, machine tabulation of votes is generally much more accurate than having people count them. Most people who've raised questions about the integrity of elections have insisted that regular people wind up counting the votes. And as you pointed out, this is very time consuming.
Right.
It can be very expensive to have 3 or 4 people double check hundreds, thousands of ballots when there's no real expectation that they're going to yield any different sorts of results. So, as you've noted, this can make the election drag out for longer. We've already seen questions about states that do have a long and cumbersome process for counting votes. And so if this drags out longer, it will, I think, feed the perception that something is amiss, that somebody is up to something.
Then what does that mean for public trust and getting people engaged again in the political process, especially when we see certain rights being stripped away?
Well, it is entirely possible that some people might be discouraged from voting because of beliefs that the election is not fair. But for the most part, the people who are most unhappy with our elections are actually more likely to vote, right? If you think that your side is somehow losing or being discriminated against in some way, it actually makes people more likely to show up, right? It makes them pay more attention to politics. And if you think about some of the messaging on the Democratic side right now, a lot of the allegations of fraud are being generated by the current presidential administration, are targeted at Democratic groups, at racial minorities, at people who live in Philadelphia or Atlanta or Detroit or other big cities. And so it is not difficult for political activists to say, you know what, the best way to deal with this is for massive numbers of our people to turn out, for us to have an election result that is so indisputably clear that nobody can argue that it was fraudulent. So this has been, I think, the irony of a lot of voter suppression tactics, that if you make it harder for people to vote, that becomes ammunition for groups that are trying to register voters. So it's not necessarily, that's not like an argument in favor, right, of voter suppression, but
No,
it
no.
suggests that for the most part, voter suppression efforts or efforts to undermine people's confidence in elections have not clearly worked, at least at the federal level.
Mhm.
Now, you might respond and say, well, sure, a civil rights group might be very aggressive in helping people understand their rights in Atlanta in the presidential election. But next year, when there's an election for a municipal office or something else that is not very exciting, that group may not be there. So you might
True.
see results in other elections that show the consequences of voter
Mhm.
suppression. But I'm not sure that these efforts will be that effective in the upcoming midterms or in the 2028 presidential election.
Okay. Again, I want to be sensitive of your time. I have so many questions for you, and I'm trying to narrow them down so that we can keep it, to a certain time frame. I do want to ask you really quickly. One of the things that you do focus on are congressional and state legislative primaries, and one of the things you say is that often extreme side people on either side come out, show up to primaries, and often we see that. Can you just talk about that dynamic really quickly, about how often people in primaries, you have the more extreme candidates show up? Why does that dynamic happen?
Sure. Well, I guess I can say a couple things about that. One of them is that unexpected election results are super exciting, and
Yeah.
they can create a narrative that often swamps the actual reality. So, to give you one example, there are a lot of reasons why Alexandria Ocasio Cortez won the primary in 2018. Her opponent was not necessarily paying a whole lot of attention.
Mm.
That district had been growing steadily more Latino for some years, and she was able to really campaign aggressively in the Latino community there. There are a lot of reasons why she won. It's not necessarily clear that she won because she was more progressive than her opponent, but her victory really created a narrative back in 2018 that the left wing of the Democratic Party was winning all of these elections, that the Democrats were moving left, and so on. And that became a frame by which people interpreted that election, right? It sort of became the reality when it's not necessarily clear that it was. So primaries are vulnerable to this sort of thing. Primary elections happen over a 6-month period. We
Hmm.
just had our first primaries day in Texas.
Texas, that's right.
And as the year goes on, the political media will seize on compelling stories, right? And they will talk about them a lot. So we're going to
Hmm.
hear a lot about the two folks that the fellow who won the Texas Democratic primary for the Senate, and we're going to hear a lot about the impending runoff on the Republican side. I don't know that that means anything for America, right? It's Texas, which is different from the rest of America. There are all sorts of dynamics there, but it will become talked about enough that it will become kind of the story about what's happening to America. So that's not necessarily what we should want from a political system, right? We should not want the way we understand our politics to be dictated by a handful of fluky results that happen several months before the election. But that's just the circumstance that primaries, I think, create for us. The other thing to note about primaries that's really important is that a tiny percentage of Americans vote in primaries. The primaries that took place in Texas, probably about 25 to 30% of eligible voters showed up.
Wow.
And there were primaries in other states, right? Arkansas, for instance, had primary elections. They were not talked about at the national level. There was nothing competitive at the statewide level. A fairly tiny percentage of folks in Arkansas turned out. So, yeah, the people who show up in races like that, often they're a little bit more partisan, often a little bit more politically extreme in their views, but they're older, they're wealthier. They are in many ways highly unrepresentative of the American public. And these folks determine our nominees in a lot of races. So primaries, I think, are a problem because so few people vote and because the things that drive people to vote are kind of fluky, right? Probably not that many people voted in Arkansas the other day because there was not necessarily that much that was exciting. But these voters in Arkansas did determine who some of, say, the state legislative candidates were going to be, are determined other nominees in fairly low profile races. And it's a problem for democracy that so few people are making these determinations. So I have a forthcoming book this summer where my co-author and I say the best thing to do would be to consolidate all of our primaries on the same day, right? It doesn't matter
Hmm.
what day it is, but to have a day in the spring, summer, early fall that all Americans go and vote in the primaries. This is what's done in a number of other countries that use things like primary elections. And it would just be a more small d democratic way to involve people in choosing nominees.
And everybody would be forced to kind of pay attention on that
They
specific
would
day.
all pay attention. If you live in a
Yes.
state that is not super exciting, you're probably more likely to vote because you'll hear the national story or there's an election in the state
Yes.
next door or something like that.
Understood. And also, I want to ask you, what about the threat when Donald Trump talks about nationalizing elections? What does that mean? What would that look like? Is that even legal?
Um, I'm not going to say never because the administration has done some things that I think are clearly unconstitutional.
Yeah.
But the Constitution gives the power to hold elections to the states. There is no federal power to seize elections. Um, we've had elections at very trying moments for our country, right? We held an
Yes.
election in the middle of the Civil War. There was an election I was just reading a great book about the election of 1812, where the United States was at war at the time with Britain, and this was the first war we'd had as a country, and there were some politicians who argued that we should call the election off and determined there was no way. So there's no way for the federal government to seize control of elections. Elections are done at the state level. The Department of Justice has some limited ability to intervene when it believes there are civil rights violations. So in the past, states that were clearly discriminating against generally, historically it's been African Americans,
Yeah.
but other voters, who were not being prevented from voting, there were ways in which the federal government could send observers, could involve itself, but there's no way to do that at scale. So theoretically, the government could raise the question that in a handful of places, people were voting who shouldn't be. In terms of the overall quality of the 2026 election, there's 50 different states are having elections. How would they choose what those places were? Um, Ironically, the places that the government has talked about the most, right? Suppose that they argue that Philadelphia is not counting its votes correctly. Well, Philadelphia is going to vote Democratic no matter what.
Right.
So it's not necessarily clear that, sending folks to Philadelphia would affect things. So there really is no way to do that. Any executive order that proposes to do this, I'm 99% sure will be struck down by the courts, and that's not 100%, right? But
Right.
I think the biggest concern is that creating a narrative about fraud causes people not to trust the results, might cause folks after the election has happened to say, well, Democrats don't legitimately control Congress. I don't think it would have a consequence on who won or lost, but it could have a consequence in how Americans feel about the results.
Understood. Okay. At the end of each show, I always like to ask my experts to end on a note of optimism. And I would love to get your top 3 tips that you would recommend to the everyday person who can feel empowered, feel like they have some agency with the current state of affairs, whether it's to be more informed, whether it's to encourage a friend who's a naysayer about elections. What are 3 tips that you would give to a listener today after this conversation?
Well, I certainly have a couple that I've given to a lot of people.
Okay.
This has been a very, very trying year. I'm
Yeah.
teaching a course right now on how to talk about politics, where I encourage a lot of 18, 19, 20-year olds to reach out to people who disagree with them. And it's very difficult to do that, but it is very important to do that. It's very important to reach out to people who don't see politics the same way you do. You don't have to talk about politics with them, but reach out to them, talk to them about something, try to find common ground on some issue, even if it's not necessarily about politics. Try to see them as human beings. That's one. A second recommendation is to do what you can to diversify the media that you get. It's very easy to accidentally slip into a bubble where all of the news that you get reinforces your priors. And just as importantly, to slip into a bubble where all the news you get just riles you up, right? Right now it's very difficult for me, to take a look at the news because a lot of what I see just gets me upset, right? And that's
Right.
a bad way to start my morning. And I guess the third, most of what happens in the world is not politics, and it is very important to put politics in its place, to understand that all of the stuff that's going on should not occupy you 24/7, should not pop up to bother you at random times. So turn off little notifications you get on your phone from your news source, right? You'll find out soon enough what's happened. You don't need to be interrupted when you're with your kids. And find something non-political to do. Go, I don't know, go bird watching, go do something that is not about politics. Do that with somebody else and try to engage with people over things that are not politics. That's not only good for your sanity, but it also means that you can address political issues refreshed, that you don't wind up being exhausted all the time by the barrage of what's happening.
Excellent. That's great advice. Dr. Boatwright, thank you so much. Where can we find your information, whether it be your book or articles you've written? Where's the best place to find you? Okay.
I teach at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. So go to their website or just look for me. Have a book coming out this summer called The Problem with Primary Elections.
Hmm.
And a book from a couple of years ago called Reform and Retrenchment that is a history of primary elections over the past century. So those are good places to start.
Thank you again. This was really a pleasure to speak with you. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me.
And now it's time to review Professor Boatwright's top 3 power plays. First, he says reach out and try to find common ground with someone who you may not agree with, but you could possibly talk to. Also, he said diversify your media consumption to make sure you get a different perspective and understand where others are coming from. And finally, he says take a break and step back from all the political noise. It can really be overwhelming. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you're feeling a little more hopeful, a little less stuck, and maybe even inspired to take action, because democracy does work when we all participate. And don't forget, sign up for our newsletter to get updates on when our next episode drops. You can go to my website, democracydoes.com. And as a bonus, if you haven't gotten one, a free and easy tip sheet on how to get involved.